Now, we have another couple of cases of regrets from people who voted for Donald Trump. Yes, surprisingly, there are people who voted for Donald Trump who aren't necessarily, people who are racist. We call those people the brick throwers, right? So what they did is that they're tired of getting crushed by the establishment, and they decided to throw a brick into the system. That brick was named Donald Trump, and the hopes for there would be change. These are some of the people that also probably would have voted for somebody like Senator Bernie Sanders because he represents change. Now, what's important about this story is that these brick throwers, they do it for they voted for Trump for a reason, as I said, for change because the status quo wasn't working. Now, one of the issues that Donald Trump successfully campaigned on, especially in the Rust Belt, is manufacturing. He said he was going to save manufacturing, he was going to bring manufacturing jobs back, and the blue-collar jobs and lifestyle with it. So now, that's what he promised to do in the campaign. And fast forward a couple of years. What's happened? Well, you could say that he's partly successful, but also not successful. So let me kind of break that down. So according to some of the numbers, American manufacturers have added nearly 500,000 jobs since Donald Trump took office. Oh, okay, well, that's interesting, right? Now, for the last 19 months in a row, now that's actually a really long streak. It's one of the longest streaks since the mid-1990s. So, okay, you could point to that and say, okay, look, hey, wow, look, Donald Trump bringing back those manufacturing jobs. But wait a minute. At the same time, and I think there's correlation here, you also had the massive weakening of labor rights in the form of course, bills like right to work, for example, in Michigan. And of course, Wisconsin, and that happened during the Obama administration, by the way. Now, I thought Obama was going to get his walking shoes and walk the picket line. Of course he didn't. You know who's been walking the picket line? Senator Bernie Sanders. Not saying anything. I'm just saying. Now, as I said, labor rights have been weakened. Wage growth is essentially flat. Why? Because what modest wage growth there has been because of the so-called booming economy has actually been eliminated due to inflation. And you also had announced job cuts by many of these large manufacturers who are still cutting jobs even though they receive massive tax cuts from Donald Trump. Now you look at that, and suddenly that boom isn't such a boom anymore, and in fact could be on its way to turning into a bust. Now, let me give you some examples of recent layoffs here. GM had announced the closure of a plant in Lordstown, Ohio last year, which would eliminate about 1,700 jobs. Carrier, in 2016, I believe, laid off 1,400 after it moved to Mexico following a deal with Trump and Pence that saved them $7 million in taxes. They made this deal and then announced later, oops, we're still going to Mexico even after we, saved all of this money in taxes. You also have Harley Davidson that's expected to lay off about 800 people by the fall. Now you look at those are just some examples of manufacturing that has decided to cut back, even after, again, receiving billions of dollars in tax breaks, about $1.5 trillion in total. That's how much your Trump tax cuts cost. 83% of that went to giant corporations. So now, nobody knows the uncertainty or the problems facing these people who are working in the industry than the workers themselves, right? So now they sat down, a couple of them, and talked to the New York Times. Now, this was during a Sunday show called The Weekly, and some Trump supporters have expressed frustration at losing their jobs or these job cuts. Now, New York Times reporter Sabrina Tavernise quoted one worker who said, quote, "It seems like no matter what he does or tries to do, it doesn't work out." So now that's a bit more, of course, pro-Trump, like, oh, he's trying, he's doing all this stuff to try to save manufacturing jobs, and it just isn't working. Okay, so you could say that maybe he's inept. But I don't even think that's entirely fair because, again, it's the president, yes, who proposes and of course, enforces laws and does he doesn't actually come up with the actual policies. Now, he could use the bully pulpit to try to, get public pressure on Congress to pass policies that might help, actual struggling workers. But in reality, the president just doesn't do everything alone. Yes, there is the power of executive orders, but they only go so far, right, when it comes to the economics of the country. So now, nonetheless, people tend to put more, I think, stock in the power of the presidency than he actually has, he or she, right? So now, let's get to more quotes here from the same person. He said, well, now what? What the heck do we do? Do we go back to beating our heads against a wall, or do we try something different? So now, again, I think this was somebody who tried to throw a brick into the establishment and was like, hey, what's going on isn't working, all right? And so we voted for Trump. We voted for change. We didn't get change. We got more establishment. The rich continue to get richer, and the poor continue to get poorer. And basically, the corporations are getting all the gains. All right. So now that's reflected in another person who was actually named. This is Rick Marsh, who voted for Trump in 2016. He said, quote, I'm sure you had more people around here voting for Trump, including myself, because he promised to bring jobs back. We need competitive manufacturing jobs. I really don't care if it's a Democrat or Republican, female, black, white. I don't care. Whoever's in there, you need to put American workers first and Americans working first. And let me tell you, we're not doing that, right? So now what we're doing here is, again, giving tax cuts to corporations, multinationals, who usually end up moving to low-wage countries like Vietnam, China, etc. Now, look, I work in manufacturing, right? I have family that works in manufacturing, so I kind of have a perspective here, right? So what's going on today, unfortunately, at least where I live, is you have mostly temp workers. Now, these temp workers have low pay, no benefits, and they end up getting treated like garbage a lot of the time. Now, that's been my experience. I have worked in that situation before. And, of course, unsurprisingly, I should say, usually happens in non-unionized shops, which right now union participation is at its lowest point, I believe, in U.S. history. So no representation, lots of temp workers, no low pay, no benefits. That's, I think, where a lot of these manufacturing jobs have come from. It's not the super high-paying jobs of yesteryear, which is unfortunately what these people want back, which is what Donald Trump had promised to bring back, and unfortunately what is not going to come back. Now, as for the uncertainty, as for these workers, I understand them because I've been them. I was them. I have felt that uncertainty. I have been angry at layoffs. I've been laid off before. I have been treated like garbage by an employer. So I understand how it all feels. And in my experiences, I have learned that they don't care about you. Again, multinational corporations, right? Part of why I got into politics in the first place is because of how people like me have been treated and have absolutely no voice in politics. Even through some of the unions, which, again, I'm a staunch supporter of unions. I don't always agree with what they do. And I definitely don't always just see eye to eye with union leadership. A lot of the leadership is also disconnected from that of the workers. And you can see for the ones, of course, that, for example, allied themselves behind Hillary Clinton, were in favor of the Keystone XL pipeline because it meant jobs, but obviously not as much. And I've talked about this before. It did not necessarily mean, or the jobs that were promised by the Obama administration, even, those job numbers were false. There were never going to be that many permanent jobs. Some temporary jobs, yes, but it would have been a disaster for the environment. Unions backed that, and I completely oppose that decision. So unions aren't always 100% correct, but in reality, we need them because workers need representation because, again, I've experienced what it's like to be in places that have no representation And it's terrible. And that's unfortunately what we have today. So now, let me get to another quote here. Marsh had said, quote, "They're going to get to a point in this country where people have had enough." Well, to be fair, I think we're already there. And he said, without the ability to feed my family or pay for my children and feed my children, what am I as a man? So now that statement, that kind of hits me right here, right? I feel that in my core. Now, again, me now kind of thinks, but wait, your worth is not defined in how much you bring home and where you work, right? And that's unfortunately a bigger conversation when it comes to, how Americans view themselves, work ethic, etc., right? But I've learned that your worth as a person is not tied to a dollar figure or how much you work. Your worth as a person is completely independent of that. But again, I feel that, right? I understand that when you're not working, when you can't find work, when you can't bring in, when you can't take care of your family, that's depressing. And it literally does cause depression. I mean, if you go from $30 an hour, which is the typical line worker wage at GM, to what, $8 an hour, $8.50 an hour at maybe a fast food place, $7.25 is the federal minimum wage, or $12 to $13 at most for a factory job, at least around my area. Well, you go from that to that. Oh, that's devastating. Not only to your pocketbook, but to your self-esteem as well. And so these people, they're living it. And Donald Trump has done nothing to boost wages or save a lot of the jobs that are leaving. In fact, he might be the cause of some of these jobs leaving. His trade policies, for example, is one thing that Harley Davidson had cited when they were leaving. So, and of course that's tariffs. Part of it's tariffs, which are a tax that's paid by the consumer. But he's also made it cheaper to move overseas. I tell you, if manufacturing does fall off between now and the election, well, then that could actually hurt Donald Trump's chances with his own base. But what's more important, other than that, is what we do for the workers. And that brings me to the future of manufacturing. I don't think a lot of those high-paying manufacturing jobs are going to come back. In fact, I think they're not coming back. Automation is going to take over, and we need a plan for that, and we need to talk about that. And unfortunately, there are very few people that are talking about that. There is one that I know of for certain, that's Andrew Yang. Now, I'm not saying I'm on the Yang gang or anything like that, but he is one person that is talking about that. And whether you agree with it or not, the plan to, give $1,000 to every person, to offset that manufacturing or loss of manufacturing, loss of these low-wage jobs due to automation, at least somebody's having a conversation. And I think more of these candidates and more politicians need to start having this conversation and have a plan for when there is automation that takes over. Because, like it or not, it is here to stay, and these jobs are not. Hey guys, hopefully you enjoyed that free video. Now I'm going to have to ask you a favor. Between the demonetization and the YouTube algorithm messing around with view counts, etc., we're having a hard time adjusting to the new YouTube reality, which is where you guys come in. See, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/TYTNation, set up to help us rely on you guys, the viewers, instead of big corporate ads. Look, you know the show. You know I'm not in favor of big corporations anyway. So help us transition away from relying on the ad model to pay the bills and sign up to be a patron, patreon.com/TYTNation. That goes a long way to help us keep the lights on. And you guys will know that you're supporting independent, progressive media.